Coming up next, BookTV presents AfterWords, an hour-long program where we invite guest hosts to interview authors. This week, Randall Kennedy and his latest book, The Persistence of the Color Line, Racial Politics and the Obama Presidency. In it, the Harvard law professor explores the influence of racial politics on the administration of the first African-American president. He attempts to answer whether Black Americans have special expectations of Mr. Obama and whether the president should feel a unique racial obligation in return. He delves into these topics with American Urban Radio White House correspondent April Ryan.
Mr. Kennedy, it is a great honor to be with you today, talking about your book, The Persistence of the Color Line, Racial Politics and the Obama Presidency. Mr. Kennedy, could you talk to me? We start out in the book with race, the historical perspective of race. Can you start out with how race played in this country from slavery to Jim Crow to civil rights?
Well, one of the first things that I wanted to do in the book was to explain to people, frankly, why was it such a big deal on election night when Barack Obama was elected president of the United States? I mean, why were there parties all across the United States? Why was there this weeping? Now, anytime a president's elected, it's a big deal, and there's emotion. But clearly this time there was something very different, something very special going on. Why was that? Well, one reason for that was this was the first Black president. And, so what's the big deal with that? Well, one of the things I wanted to show was the degree to which Black Americans have been marginalized, have been snubbed, have been excluded from electoral politics. So I thought that it would be useful for readers to know about that history. It would be useful for readers to know, for instance, that in the history of the United States, there have only been two popularly elected Black governors, Deval Patrick in Massachusetts and Doug Wilder in Virginia. In the history of the United States, there have only been three popularly elected United States senators: Barack Obama from Illinois, Carol Moseley Brown from Illinois, and again from Massachusetts. It'll come to me in just a second. Yeah. Ed Brooke.
Right.
Ed Brooke, the first popularly elected
Before
Black
Reconstruction.
senator. No.
After Reconstruction.
One thing, people talk about Reconstruction, during the Reconstruction era, and that in the 19th century, it was legislatures selected who would be the senators. So it was the legislatures who selected the senators. That's why I say this was, and there were Blacks who were elected by legislatures to go represent their states in the Senate. In fact, the first, and one of the most interesting stories, I think, in the book, is the story of Hiram Revels,
right,
who was the first Black to represent a state in the Senate. Now, the interesting thing about Hiram Revels is that Hiram Revels was selected by the Mississippi legislature to fill the seat that had been occupied by Jefferson Davis. Jefferson Davis had been the president of the Confederacy. And then the Mississippi legislature chose Hiram Revels, a Black man, to fill the seat that had previously been occupied by Jefferson Davis. And then again, I talk about this in the book,
right,
when Hiram Revels goes to represent Mississippi as a senator, a Reconstruction era senator, there's a big debate on whether he can be seated, because some take the position that he cannot lawfully be seated because, after all, before the promulgation of the 14th Amendment in 1868, Blacks could not be citizens of the United States, according to the infamous Dred Scott decision. And so there was this big fight. Well, has he been a citizen of the United States long enough to fulfill the requirements to be a United States Senator. And there was a big fight, and finally he was seated, but there was a big fight about it. And so I thought that all of that history would be useful for readers to understand as a way of appreciating just why it was that the election of Barack Obama was so momentous and why it meant so much to so many people, particularly black people.
I talked to Al Sharpton not long ago, and he said, we have no model for this, and i.e. the tears, the pride, but at the same time, we have to hold this president accountable. Mm-hmm. And within the pages of this book, you talk about those who hold this president accountable. Could you talk to me about your grade for this president at this point in time? You're very critical of him. You talk about how race is strategically placed for him, how he is acceptable for whites, but yet he has not gravitated as much towards the African American mm-hmm. community. Could you talk to me about that?
Sure. Point number one, being president of the United States, and it's an extraordinarily difficult job for anybody. So that's point number one.
It's an extreme position.
It's an extraordinary. Here, you are the most powerful single individual in the world.
E pluribus unum.
And so it's going to be difficult for anybody. Now here comes Barack Obama. 2 wars going on, an economic catastrophe, a politically divided country, and he's a black man. Now that is, so for purposes of level of difficulty, you think about athletic events, you get points for levels of difficulty. The level of difficulty is very, very high, and that must be appreciated when it comes to judging the president. Now, as you know from my book, I'm critical of the president along a wide range of dimensions, and I don't have any problem with voicing criticism of the president. At the same time, when one voices criticism of the president, one must understand the difficulties he faces, including the special difficulties he faces because of his race. Barack Obama had to overcome his blackness to become president of the United States. He has had to overcome his blackness to effectively govern the United States, and he will have to overcome his blackness yet again in order to be reelected. So, I'm happy to go into various issues. I'm happy to voice criticisms of the president, but it has to be against the backdrop of the special difficulties that he faces.
And it's interesting, you have such a special perspective from this president. You were invited to the wedding. You are a Harvard law professor. President Obama was a student at Harvard. First Lady Michelle Obama was your research assistant?
Yeah, she was.
You were invited to the wedding. Unfortunately, you didn't make it. But can you talk to me about that special relationship and wrestling with this kind of book?
Well, first of all, I wouldn't say that I have a real special. I knew of Barack Obama when he was a student. The reason why I knew of him as a student and saw him, and I think we talked a couple of times when he was a student. One reason why I knew of him is because he was a quite outstanding student. He was president of the Harvard Law Review, the first black president of the Harvard Law Review. Several of my colleagues talked about this remarkable student they had, Barack Obama. That's a very unusual thing. There are a lot of smart students at Harvard Law School, very smart, very outstanding. He really did stand apart. So I knew of him in that way. The First Lady, Michelle Obama, I knew a bit. She went to Princeton. I went to Princeton. So when she, came to Harvard Law School, we met. She was a very impressive student, very, very well organized. She did some research for me. Right. I have not really stayed in touch with them, in the subsequent years. I've admired them from afar, but I'm not really, part of their circle. I thought of maybe trying to seek to have an interview with the president for this book. I decided, not to pursue that. The reason I decided not to pursue that was because I thought, well, if the president gives you an interview, the president is essentially giving you a favor, and I didn't want to feel. I didn't want to feel, beholden at all, even the least little bit. I wanted to feel completely distant. I wanted to feel like I could say what I thought without any inhibition. And